In early November of 1977, a young woman named Catherine Lori Baker was walking through Los Angeles at night when she was approached by two men. Of course, that would have been nothing new for a pretty 24-year-old like her, and so she took it in stride, humoring the men who were clearly trying to pick her up and even offering up her driver's license as proof of her age when they asked how old she was. Once she provided that, though, the situation changed and the men decided to leave her alone as they drove off. The reason they did that was because it was at that point they found out she was the daughter of movie star Peter Lorre, someone probably most famous for his portrayal of serial killer Hans Beckert in 1931's Fritz Lang classic M. Catherine Lori Baker ended up going home safe that night, unaware of how close she had just come to meeting her untimely end, and just how much her celebrity status had caused the two men attempting to pick her up to think twice about making her the next victim of the Hillside Stranglers. This is Monsters. Angelo Anthony Buono Jr. was born on October 5, 1934 in Rochester, New York, to a pair of first-generation Italian-American immigrants originally hailing from San Bono, Italy. Throughout much of his youth, partially as a result of his parents' divorce and him being separated from his father at an early age, Angelo found it difficult to keep out of trouble. That all led to him developing a deep hatred of women, so much so that he openly talked to his friends at school about his desire to find girls and sexually assault them. There was a lot of anger and violent tendencies within the young man, and with him always looking for an outlet, crime became something of a way of life for Angelo early on. In fact, by the time he reached adulthood, he already had a lengthy rap sheet that included arrests and convictions for crimes such as grand theft auto, assault, and sexual assault. He actually found something of a hero and role model to base his life on after reading about the notorious LA-based rapist Carol Chessman. It would be easy to assume many women wouldn't feel safe around Angelo, but as it turned out, he was something of a ladies' man. In fact, over the course of his life, he would enter into a number of serious relationships, with him actually getting married on 4 separate occasions. What those women all soon learned, though, was that once behind closed doors, their new husband was not the sweet darling they thought he was. Rather, he was a violent and sadistic figure, someone who hated women and who enjoyed humiliating and hurting them whenever he could. So, as can be expected in those situations, none of the marriages lasted long. His first marriage to Geraldine Vinyl, a high school sweetheart he wed in 1955, would only last 1 week before the two separated. And once they separated, Angelo also took that as an opportunity to cut the child they'd had together prior to that out of his life, to the point that he refused to pay any child support or even let the boy call him Dad. Of course, that wouldn't be the end of his romantic liaisons, though, as just 2 years later Angelo would marry again, that time to a woman named Mary Castillo. But while that relationship would be longer lasting, with it continuing for 7 years and giving the soon-to-be killer 5 more children he'd later disown as well, by the time 1964 came around, Mary had filed for divorce on account of what she described as her husband's violent nature and perverse sexual needs. As Darcy O'Brien, author of the book The Hillside Stranglers, would later describe their sex life, quote, "Her pain seemed to give him his greatest pleasure, and when she failed to respond to his pinches and slaps and piledriver poundings, he would tell her she was a dead piece of ass." Nor did she share his passion for anal intercourse. But Angelo was not a man to be denied. Although he never drank, he beat and kicked her when she failed to please him, and far from caring whether the children witnessed the beatings, he seemed to want them to watch. It was true that when it came to matters of the bedroom, Angelo was interested in some unorthodox activities, with that evidently being way too much for his second wife to handle. The same would apply to the woman he entered into a relationship with after that, Nanette Campina, as pretty early into that union, the pair would split when his sexual interests combined with his overall aggression became overwhelming to her. The final straw for her came once it was revealed that Angelo had been sexually abusing his 14-year-old stepdaughter. Of course, if Nanette had reported that incident to the police, Angelo might have been put behind bars, altering the trajectory of his life. But perhaps out of fear, she chose not to do so. And that allowed him to remain a free man for long enough to marry another woman, Deborah Taylor, on a whim in 1972. That marriage would never really amount to much, and the pair would never even bother to move in together. But someone who would form a much closer bond with Angelo would come along soon after, as it was 3 years later in 1975 that he first met his younger cousin, Kenneth Bianchi. When it came to Kenneth, he didn't enter the world until a couple of decades after his cousin, with him being born on May 22, 1951, also in Rochester, New York. But while 17 years might have separated them, they did share some similarities in that they both endured difficult upbringings tarred by emotional problems. In Kenneth's case, however, none of his issues could be blamed on an early parental divorce. Instead, they were likely due to the fact that after being born to a 17-year-old alcoholic sex worker who had no means of supporting him, he was put up for adoption while still a baby and later given a new home by Nicholas and Frances Bianchi. Obviously, that had a pretty negative impact on the youngster's psyche, and that, combined with his new mother's severe overprotectiveness on account of him having a number of seizures as a toddler, contributed towards him developing a number of emotional issues as time went on. Those issues included compulsive lying and regularly throwing violent tantrums. That all led to him doing pretty poorly in school despite being an otherwise intelligent young man. By that point, though, other things in his personal life had already added to his overall sense of hopelessness and alienation, like the death of his adopted father in 1965 after a sudden heart attack. Still, for as chaotic as his younger days were, Kenneth still made time to find love. The love he would find would be with Brenda Peck, his high school girlfriend. In fact, they would end up getting married in 1971, just 1 year after graduating. Sadly, though, like with Angelo, Kenneth's marriage would be short-lived and would ultimately end after only 8 months. After discovering that Kenneth had a habit of sleeping around with other women, Brenda called it quits. That's right, similar to his adopted uncle, Kenneth was someone with an insatiable sexual appetite. While there's nothing to suggest that early on in his life his desires included hurting others, there is plenty of evidence to show that he was someone who enjoyed holding power over people. That was the reason he had the goal of becoming a police officer. He had actually started down that path after enrolling in Monroe Community College not long after his divorce, where he began studying police science and psychology. Unfortunately for the young man, though, that would be another situation where his academic attempts failed him. Pretty quickly, he found himself growing bored of college and he dropped out. Sure, he still wanted to be a cop, but now he figured the best way to do that was just to apply for a job at his local Monroe County Sheriff's Department. When that ultimately failed to lead to any gainful employment, he resorted to working as a security guard instead, a job which left him entirely unfulfilled. In order to find some excitement, he started engaging in petty crime by stealing from his employers, something that fully sent him down a path where there would soon be no return from. Unsurprisingly, when his employer found out that he had been stealing from them, Kenneth was fired. When that eventually led to there being no more work for him in the New York area, he packed up and moved across the country to Los Angeles at the behest of his mother, where his adopted cousin Angelo Buono was by that point living and working as an auto upholsterer. She hoped that it would allow the young man a second chance at life in a new place. Not that Angelo was too happy about his cousin showing up on his doorstep one day, though. No, at least initially he was not a fan of having someone else invade his life like that. As time went on, however, he found that he had a lot more in common with Kenneth than he first assumed, and that would lead him to developing a fondness for the man. When it came to Kenneth's feelings towards his uncle, it seemed he outright idolized him. That was largely on account of how confident he appeared to be and how successful he was at attracting women. So it should come as no surprise to learn that pretty soon the pair became inseparable. They spent most of their free time going out drinking together and picking up girls. One trick in particular that Angelo showed his nephew, which Kenneth really seemed to appreciate, was his use of fake police badges to convince sex workers to sleep with them free of charge. Ultimately, though, Kenneth knew that all the partying and casual sex was not going to support him in the long term, and that if he wanted to reach his goal of becoming a real cop one day, he was going to have to first get a stable job and find a place of his own to stay. So that's what he did in July of 1976, 6 months after moving to Los Angeles. He started working at a California land title company and used his first paycheck to get his own apartment at 809 East Garfield Avenue in Glendale. While he was now far more settled down and ready to move on to the next stage of his life as soon as the opportunity presented itself, he was disappointed to find that when he did apply to both the Los Angeles and Glendale police departments, they both turned him down on account of him not having the right skills and qualifications. Not that it was all bad news for Kenneth, however. He ended up meeting and falling in love with a co-worker at the land title company named Kelly Boyd. Of course, just as he'd done with his previous relationship, it didn't take Kenneth long to start sleeping around with other women again. That was all made a whole lot easier as a result of him continuing to regularly go on cruising trips with his uncle throughout the downtown LA area. Really, even more than being in a committed relationship, even more than being a cop, that was the lifestyle that Kenneth realized that he actually wanted the most. And that was most certainly a sentiment shared by Angelo, as he was also having the time of his life tricking prostitutes into sleeping with him and, in the process, using them to offload his sadistic sexual energy. But eventually even that wouldn't be enough for the pair. No, as the summer of 1977 came around, they decided they wanted more, and that was what led to them concocting a plan. Now, some believe that part of the reason Kenneth was so willing to engage in the plan at that point was because his girlfriend had gotten pregnant in June of 1977. He'd become scared of what the future held for him as a more conventional suburban father, someone who wouldn't have the same time and space to do what he was doing at nights away from the prying eyes of his lover. When it came to Angelo, though, his motives have far more clarity and far less speculation surrounding them. He was, after all, someone who hated women and who enjoyed both hurting and exploiting them whenever and wherever he could. So when they came to the decision that rather than just pick up sex workers at night, they should become pimps and have the sex workers work for them instead, it felt like the natural next step in what they had already been doing. That's why they both became so enamored by the idea, and, before the year was out, they had found 2 teenage runaways named Sabra Hanna and Becky Spears who they were able to manipulate into working for them. And giving them a healthy cut of their income, of course, all in exchange for supposed protection. Unsurprisingly, however, rather than protect these women from any potentially bothersome clients, both Angelo and Kenneth took to abusing the pair themselves whenever the opportunity arose. While Sabra and Becky wanted to flee numerous times at that point, they were convinced to stay and endure what was happening to them after Angelo claimed he had connections to the mafia and could have the girls murdered should they even think about running. Over the weeks and months that followed, whenever Sabra and Becky weren't out earning money for their new pimps, they were forced to have sex with them instead. Of course, when Angelo had sex with women, he liked to get very aggressive, to the point of causing physical injury and long-term emotional damage. There was a light at the end of the tunnel for the 2 young girls, though, when Becky was informed to go visit a new client named David Wood. As it turned out, David was a prominent lawyer in the local Los Angeles area. When Becky felt comfortable enough around him, she told him all about the misery she and her friend had endured at the hands of her pimps, including but not limited to being sexually assaulted so savagely that she at times had to wear a tampon in her rectum to avoid her bowels leaking. That was when he decided there was no way he could let the situation continue. Both Becky and Sabra were hustled away to a safe place where they would be out of reach of Angelo and Kenneth. Unfortunately, though, while Becky would manage to escape for good at that point, Sabra wasn't so lucky. Rather, she endured weeks of additional abuse as the two men took out their anger on her specifically. That said, once another opportunity did finally arise, she also managed to make an escape. That left the pimps without any girls to exploit and without any of the extra income they'd become accustomed to coming in. So doing what they felt they needed to do, they began to search for new women to pimp out. That eventually led them to a local sex worker named Deborah Noble, who, while she wouldn't agree to work for them, did agree to sell them her trick list of regular customers that could be utilized once the men finally did acquire some new girls. The only problem with that, though, was that the trick list Deborah sold them turned out to be useless. So, furious about being conned by who they thought of as a low-life prostitute, both Angelo and Kenneth decided she needed to be put in her place. In their rage, the men formed a plan to murder Deborah, but luckily for her, once they went looking for their target, they were unable to find her. Unluckily for Deborah's friend, Yolanda Washington, however, Angelo and Kenneth came across her instead. Since she was the only one they could reach and was also a sex worker herself, they eventually decided she would have to die in her friend's place. It didn't matter if her only crime was being there with Deborah when she initially sold the trick list to Angelo and Kenneth. She was a woman in the sex trade and as such was just as worthy of being killed in their eyes. At some point in early October of 1977, the 19-year-old would become the first victim of the Hillside Stranglers when she was kidnapped, beaten, sexually assaulted, and then strangled to death by the pair. After they were done, they took her nude body and dumped it on a hillside near the Ventura Freeway. Of course, when Yolanda's body was found a few days later on October 18th, investigators pretty quickly figured out that the young girl had been a sex worker in the area. Because of that, they came to the conclusion that the crime was likely the work of an angry customer or a pimp who had taken out their rage on her. What they didn't realize, though, was that they were looking at the beginning of a spree of murders because the perpetrators had developed an apparent taste for the killing and enjoyed the feeling of power it gave them. Angelo and Kenneth set about looking for more victims, something they would continue to do by posing as police officers to women working the streets. Once they had their prey in their grasp, their next step would be to take them back to a quiet location, such as Angelo's upholstery store, and have their way with them there. When they were done, they would bring the woman's life to a grisly end by means of torture and strangulation. That was what happened to Judith Lynn Miller when she was picked up by the pair on October 31st of that same year. In her case, it would be considered even more tragic as she was only 15 years old at the time of her death. When her body was discovered the following day on Alta Terrace in La Crescenta, a small neighborhood 12 miles or 20 kilometers north of downtown Los Angeles, a resident had covered her body with a tarp so as to not disturb the children in the area. Investigators found her naked with ligature marks around her neck, wrists, and ankles. Like with Yolanda Washington, Judith had been sexually assaulted and beaten before she was killed and dumped. But while there was no reason to assume the two murders were related initially, that would change upon further investigation when police discovered that the young girl had also recently become a sex worker after dropping out of high school. That led the authorities to think that there may be a pattern starting to develop. That wasn't the only revelation to come while investigating Judith's death. During an autopsy, an unusual piece of fluff was found stuck to her eyelid, something that would become important later down the line. For the time being, however, there was little evidence that might lead them towards the killer or killers. Because of that, all they could do was wait and see if what they now believed might be a serial killer would strike again. And strike again they did, because in November of 1977, another 6 women would be murdered, with the duo carrying out the same modus operandi each time. They would cruise the streets posing as police officers and pick up local sex workers under the pretense of having sex with them. When they were back at Angelo's auto upholstery shop at 703 East Colorado Street in Glendale, they would sexually assault, beat, and ultimately murder them. Once that was done, they'd clean up the body as best they could and dump it in a location of their choice, all before moving on to the next victim. Their third victim would be Lisa Kasten, a 21-year-old waitress and dancer for a cabaret troupe named the LA Knockers. That murder would appear to have an even deeper motivation of sexual hatred behind it. After apparently being disappointed with the fact that Lisa had hairy legs, something they only discovered once they had gotten her undressed, the pair decided not to sodomize her as they had their prior victims. Instead, they sexually assaulted her in other ways. Then, when they were done with that, they strangled her and dumped her body near the Chevy Chase Country Club in Glendale, the same place she was found on November 6th. Of course, when police were called to the scene that morning, they immediately connected the body to the murders of Yolanda Washington and Judith Lynn Miller, as it carried so many of the same patterns. That said, they were a little confused as to why this time their mystery killer or killers had chosen to target someone who wasn't a sex worker. To be fair, that's a question many have asked in the years since. After all, it did seem to go against what the Hillside Stranglers had been doing before that. Maybe they couldn't find a suitable working woman that night and they felt Lisa was the next best option. Maybe the fact that she was a dancer was good enough of a reason for them. They were a pair who felt that all women were second class after all, and as such, fair game to be abused by men. So it's not unreasonable to assume the latter explanation is true. Whatever the reason, Lisa Kasten's death would not be enough to quench their ever-growing bloodlust. And that was why, as the month went on, they continued to target unsuspecting young women, with it being at that point that they had their very nearly ill-fated encounter with Catherine Lori Baker. Of course, Catherine would not end up going with the pair that night as, once they realized who she was, the two men understood taking her would bring too much heat down upon them. So instead they targeted 28-year-old Evelyn Jane King, an aspiring actress who was picked up by the pair on the evening of November 9th after she had finished an acting class. From there, like the prior victims, she was taken to Angelo's shop, sexually assaulted, and murdered in an absolutely brutal fashion. What makes Evelyn's ordeal stand out a little more, however, is that there was a first-hand account of what actually took place that night, an account that came from Kenneth himself when he was later questioned by detectives about the incident. As he would put it, once he and Angelo convinced the young woman to get in their car that night by posing as police officers who wanted to question her about something, they drove her back to the upholstery store and there, before anything else took place, ordered her to go to the bathroom. Not that that was a fetish for them or anything. No, it was something they did with each of their victims. The reason was so that their bowels and bladders wouldn't fail while they were being tortured and wouldn't leave a mess behind in their wake as a result. It was definitely a sad way for things to start, and after it was done and out of the way, the Hillside Stranglers would next strip Evelyn and shave both her legs and her genitals. Then once that was over, they set about sexually assaulting her repeatedly, all while she screamed in misery, a sound which no doubt brought them a sick joy. Ultimately, though, they became bored and decided it was time to kill her, something they did by placing a bag over her head and suffocating her. That wasn't enough punishment, though, as one of them took one final opportunity to sodomize her as she was dying. To say it was a pretty grim ending for this young woman would be an understatement, but things only got worse from there because the pair's next target, or targets to be more precise, would be two young schoolgirls, 12-year-old Dolores Ann Cepeda and 14-year-old Sonia Marie Johnson. The pair were picked up while they were out shopping at Eagle Rock Plaza, just east of Glendale, on November 13th. The girls were on their way home for the day and had just gotten off a bus on York Boulevard and North 46th Avenue when they were seen being approached by a two-tone sedan that had two men inside of it. A conversation took place and the girls made the unfortunate decision to get into the vehicle. While there's no direct first-hand accounts of what happened to them after that, it is clear that, like with all the prior victims, They were sexually assaulted and beaten in severe and shocking ways, all before being strangled to death and dumped in a trash heap on a hillside near Dodger Stadium. Their bodies would ultimately be discovered on November 20th when a 9-year-old boy who was treasure hunting around the trash heap made the grisly find. To make matters worse, by that point the girls had already begun to decompose, making it an even more traumatic moment for that young child to have endured. But Dolores and Sonia weren't the only bodies that were discovered that day. No, within the same 24-hour period, police also found the body of a 20-year-old honors student at the Art Center College of Design named Christina Weckler. Christina had been found on a hillside between Glendale and Eagle Rock by a group of hikers with the typical ligature marks across her wrist, ankles, and neck. As it would later be revealed, the reason she was chosen as a victim was because Kenneth had taken a shine to her and asked her out on a date, only for his advances to be turned down on account of her feeling like he gave off the vibes of a used car salesman. What made Christina's death even more troubling than any of the others by that point, though, was that the method of murder suggested the killer or killers were experimenting with new ways of torture. That was because she had been injected with Windex cleaning spray, effectively making her death one that came about via means of lethal injection. Clearly then, there was a very serious situation going on, but it wouldn't be until the discovery of Evelyn Jane King's body 3 days later on November 23rd near the Los Feliz Boulevard off-ramp of the Golden State Freeway that a task force was finally created, as it became all too apparent the murders were not going to stop unless drastic action was taken. From there, a 30-man team would be assembled by members of not only the Los Angeles Police Department, but also the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department and the Glendale Police Department, all with the aim of capturing and bringing to justice the person who is now officially being dubbed in the media the Hillside Strangler. With all of the deaths now out there for the public to digest, it understandably created something of a panic amongst the citizens of the greater Los Angeles area. Parents kept their children indoors whenever possible, women bought large dogs to protect themselves, and families all over the area engaged in things like self-defense classes, all while they were stocking up on weapons and fitting their homes with new locks and security systems. Unfortunately, though, that would not stop Angelo Buono and Kenneth Bianchi. Despite the increase in awareness throughout the community, their next strike was brazen. On November 28th, in broad daylight, in front of an elderly neighbor, they abducted 18-year-old Lauren Ray Wagner outside of her home in the San Fernando Valley. That might have seemed a little reckless of the pair, but it wasn't like the neighbor was able to identify them after the fact. When the police later arrived on the scene, all she could give them was a vague description of one of the kidnappers, who was posing as a police officer, being young and tall, and the other being old and short with bushy hair. The witness explained that the last thing she heard Lauren scream as she was being carried off was, quote, "You won't get away with this." Unfortunately, they were getting away with it because, assuming it had been actual police who had taken the young woman away, the neighbor neglected to mention she'd seen anything until the following morning. It was only after Lauren's parents realized their daughter hadn't come home and that her car was sitting across the street with the door oddly ajar that they sounded the alarm. Of course, by that point it was too late, as later on the 29th, Lauren's body was discovered in the hills around Mount Washington. Just like with the other victims, she had been beaten and sexually assaulted, but she had also been subjected to electric shocks before she was finally killed via means of strangulation. Obviously then, considering the fact 2 men were reported to have taken Lauren, that was the moment police first began to truly believe they had to be dealing with more than one killer. That said, there would be no concrete proof of that being the case by then. As far as the media was concerned, the case would still be referred to in the singular form, with headlines often talking about the Hillside Strangler. But whether it was one person or 2 involved, the fact remained that the authorities still had to find some way of tracking their mystery assailants down. Little did investigators know that at least one of those assailants would be far closer than they realized. The reason for that was because Kenneth still harbored ambitions of joining the police force one day. Despite his wave of murders, he had applied to the LAPD again. That time, while he hadn't been given a job right off the bat, he had been invited to join officers on a few ride-alongs around the city. Not that Angelo knew about it at the time, of course. No, if he'd known something like that was going on, he would have lost his mind with rage at how much danger his accomplice was putting them in. Really, the only person who was close to Kenneth who knew about those ride-alongs was his girlfriend Kelly Boyd, someone who remained completely oblivious to what her partner was doing in the evenings with his uncle. That was mostly because she was spending all of her time raising their infant child. You probably won't be surprised to learn that Kenneth wasn't the most present father. In fact, by that point when he wasn't killing, he was far more interested in gaining any little tidbits he could from the police about the case, with that just serving to keep him informed about how safe they were from being caught. Of course, that just gave him the added thrill of knowing he was right under their noses the whole time. Meanwhile, as that was happening, the citizens of the Los Angeles area, mainly the young women who lived there, were left in a constant state of fear as they worried about being the next victim of the Hillside Strangler. And for one particularly unlucky woman, 17-year-old sex worker Kimberly Martin, those fears would turn into a reality. On December 9, 1977, Kimberly was informed by the escort agency she was working for that a customer had ordered her services and that she needed to meet them at an apartment near Los Angeles City Hall immediately. 5 days later, on December 14th, her body would be found in a deserted lot nearby bearing all the same bruises and markings as the prior victims. She even had the same electrical burns on her palms that Lauren Wagner had. When investigators later checked the apartment she'd been dispatched to by her agency on the 9th, they discovered it was vacant and had been broken into sometime not long before the murder happened, evidently by the men who would use it as a killing ground. At that point, you'd be forgiven for thinking that Angelo and Kenneth assumed they were invincible and that their next victim would be picked up as soon as possible. But in a curious move, the pair decided to wait until February of the following year before they struck again. Whether that was a result of them feeling like the heat was getting too much and that they needed to lay low, or whether they just couldn't find a suitable victim is unknown. One thing is for sure, and that's that by the dawn of spring, they came across 20-year-old student and part-time waitress Cindy Lee Hudspeth and decided she was the right person to target. She was picked up and taken down the same horrible path as the 9 victims before her. After they were done, as with all their prior victims, they dumped her body. Though this time, rather than just leave the girl on a hill or in an empty lot, they shoved her corpse into the trunk of her orange Datsun and pushed that car over a cliff. A far more dramatic way of getting rid of their prey. Thankfully, though, that would end up being the last murder the pair committed together, because not long after it was complete and the girl was found by a helicopter pilot the following day on February 17th, Kenneth would tell Angelo all about the excursions he'd been going on with the police over the past few months. Needless to say, that sent Angelo into a fury, and it led to him telling his cousin that they needed to get out of the state for a while, as there was no telling what the cops had been able to figure out while Kenneth was riding along with them. So, listening to Angelo's demands, Kenneth took his girlfriend and his child and followed him up to Bellingham, Washington, where it was hoped they'd escape the net the authorities had cast in Southern California. Once they were in Bellingham, though, the younger of the two just couldn't help himself from continuing to seek out victims. That was how, on January 12, 1979, without Angelo's knowledge, he had 2 college students meet him at a house under the pretense of doing a house-sitting job. 22-year-old Karen Mandick and 27-year-old Diane Wilder met him at the house where they were sexually assaulted and killed in much the same fashion as he had done before when he was working alongside his cousin. With Angelo not being there to make sure greater care was taken in covering their tracks, Kenneth ended up getting sloppy. That meant when the bodies were discovered the following day, it didn't take long for the subsequent investigation to lead the cops to his door, as there were records of the initial phone call he had made to the girls. Obviously, at that point, they brought him in for questioning, and upon doing so, they realized that his ID stated he'd previously lived near Los Angeles, the same place the Hillside Stranglers victims had all been killed in a very similar manner to the way Karen and Diane had been. But that wasn't all. At that point, it was also discovered that Kenneth had lived close to Christina Weckler, the sixth victim of the Strangler. In fact, Christina had even written about how creeped out she was by him in her diary after he'd asked her out. So by that point, it became increasingly clear that the police had found their man and that the case was about to be solved. Or at least that it was about to be partially solved, because by then the authorities had become increasingly certain the Hillside Strangler was actually two men. So, hoping they could convince the man they had in custody to give up his accomplice, they questioned him some more. But ever loyal to Angelo, Kenneth would not give him up. Rather, he attempted to argue he actually had dissociative identity disorder and that it was actually one of his other personalities, one named Steve, who had committed the crimes he was being accused of. And as it happened, at least initially, some of the psychiatrists who were brought in to assess Kenneth actually fell for it. Dr. Martin Orn, however, was not one of them. He saw through the whole act, and that quickly led Kenneth to realizing that the jig was up. If he did want to stand any chance of staying out of prison, he was going to have to start cooperating. So that's what he did, completely and utterly, and not just by offering broad strokes either. Rather, Kenneth spilled everything at that point, telling investigators all about Angelo and even going as far as to implicate him as being the real ringleader behind the string of murders. Then, once he felt confident Angelo was the one in the firing line, the younger of the two killers explained in detail how many of the murders had happened and what their motives had been. It was at that point that the authorities were able to go back and check that old piece of fluff that had been found on Judith Miller's eyelid and match it to a chair that had come from Angelo's upholstery shop. Of course, if Kenneth thought that was going to get him off the hook completely, then he was very wrong. Whether he was the ringleader or not, he was still either partially or fully responsible for the deaths of 12 women, and that meant once Angelo was captured soon after and the two were brought to court, the judge would have no issue laying down severe sentences on both of them, even if it did take a while before those sentences would be handed down. The reason for that was because it would take a full 2 years to go through the mountain of evidence against the pair. It may have delayed the trial, but the good news was that it resulted in more than enough evidence to prove the murderous cousins were guilty of the crimes they were being charged with. In November of 1983, Angelo Buono was found guilty on 9 counts of murder and given life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, while Kenneth Bianchi was found guilty on 11 counts of murder and given life with the possibility of parole on account of his willingness to cooperate during the investigation. Had the presiding judge been able to give them a harsher sentence, he would have, as he stated at the time when addressing the men post-sentencing, quote, "I would not have the slightest reluctance to impose the death penalty in this case were it within my power to do so." Ironically, these two defendants utilized almost every form of legalized execution against their victims. The defendants have escaped any form of capital punishment. In the end, the death penalty was not on the cards, and so the pair would get away with living out the rest of their days behind bars. Still, that was not the end of the story, as while in prison, drama would continue to find the Hillside Stranglers. In the case of Angelo, that drama would center around him falling in love with a supervisor named Christine Kazuka, who worked at the same Calipatria State Prison he was being held at in California. That controversial love story would eventually blossom into a situation where the pair got married, with them remaining married all the way up until his death from a heart attack in 2022. As for Kenneth, well, he also found love while being held at Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla. In his case, however, it would not be a member of staff at the prison who won his heart. Rather, it would be a crazed fan of his named Veronica Compton who first contacted him by letter after he was imprisoned. As had happened with so many murderers in the past like Ted Bundy and John Wayne Gacy, it seemed Kenneth found a certain type of woman was attracted to him. That would lead to the two getting married in 1989 and then hatching a plan to get Kenneth out of prison. During a visit to her husband, Veronica smuggled a rubber glove containing Kenneth's semen out of the prison. Then she took a young woman to a hotel room with the intention of strangling her and planting the semen on her body. Her goal was to make it look like Kenneth had been set up and the real murderer was still on the loose. Thankfully, she wasn't able to carry out the murder and was arrested for attempting to strangle the woman she brought to the hotel room. She was released from prison in 2003. Kenneth remains in prison after an unsuccessful attempt to get parole in 2010. One thing he has been able to do successfully, though, is change his name. In fact, he's done that on multiple occasions since his incarceration began. That's right, after becoming Nicholas Fontana early on during his sentence in 1984, something he thought would stop as many people from targeting him in prison as they wouldn't know who he was, he formally became Anthony D'Amato in November of 2023. But regardless of what name he currently goes by, he continues to remain behind bars, and he likely will remain there until he dies, which, considering the fact he's now in his 70s, may not be too far away. Really, the only question left at this point is whether or not he'll ever be convicted of any additional murders. The reason that remains a possibility is because there is some compelling circumstantial evidence that suggests Kenneth might have also been the man responsible for the infamous and unsolved Alphabet murders which took place during the early 1970s, not long before the crime spree of the Hillside Stranglers began. Sure, he may have always denied that was the case and always claimed he knew nothing of those murders, but the fact that the girls who were killed died in remarkably similar ways to the victims of the Hillside Stranglers, combined with the reality that those murders took place in Rochester back when Kenneth was still living in New York, has led many to believe that he was indeed the culprit. At the end of the day, though, that's all speculation and nothing concrete has ever linked him to those crimes. So it may be a case that he actually didn't do it, and even if he did, we may never find out the truth at this point. One grisly murder which branches off from the case of the Hillside Stranglers, which can be confirmed, is that of Christopher Buono, the grandson of Angelo Buono. It was in 2007 that Christopher carried out his family's unfortunate legacy when he shot his grandmother, Mary Castillo, the second wife of Angelo, in the head and then turned the gun on himself. As to why he did that, well, that remains unclear, but it is known that it was only a few months prior to the event that he learned of his grandfather's true identity. So it's possible that knowledge triggered something in him that drove him over the edge and sent him on a murderous spiral. All we can hope, then, is that that will be the last untimely death associated with either Angelo or Kenneth, and that from this point onwards the world will finally be able to move on from their crimes, because they've already been responsible for enough pain and suffering, enough to last for several lifetimes. The world is a better place without these monsters in it. If you're a fan of true crime, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss an episode. You can also hit like or leave us a comment. You can check out our other show, Somewhere Sinister, on YouTube or anywhere that you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to support the show, check out our merchandise at thisismonsters.com. The link is in the description. Thanks again, and be safe.